All right, good to go.
Thank you, Tyler. All right, so with that, let me turn it over to David, if I could, with some thoughts from him from the discussion with Wellesley.
Sure. Hopefully all received a little write-up that went out earlier this morning, I think. That represents, I started with material that Duncan Allen had prepared on many towns, and then sort of dug a little deeper with a lot of it, and ended up having a useful conversation a little earlier this month with two people, or actually three people in Wellesley. One is Megan Jopp, who is Wellesley's equivalent of Kate Fitzpatrick. Her title is executive director, but she's essentially the main administrative person who works directly with the select board there. She's not the town manager, but she's instrumental. And then Colette O'Frank was one of the select board members and is the one who has been doing most of the transportation related matters for the select board. And then third, their DPW director is David Cohen, who I think is certainly well known to Karis and probably to others here. It was my first time meeting David and my second time meeting the other two. The write-up I restructured a little bit from last month. Just it now kind of represents, I think, the priority or the most important takeaway from me was, or two takeaways were that Colette O'Frank is a fairly new addition to the select board, and her energy on transportation matters is great and wonderful and pivotal for the town at this point. But she would be one of the first to admit that it is it's a little overwhelming for her, and she's still trying to stay on top of all these matters. And I think I would say that, kind of like Needham, these things grow up organically in different places, and eventually there becomes a need to do some coordination. I think we're in that mode now ourselves. Wellesley has had that same experience, so that where the energy is right now on transportation matters, planning matters, would seem to be primarily within this sustainable mobility plan that they've got, and a transportation committee or working group, depending on which label you find at a given moment. That seems to be shepherding the development of this new plan. It's mentioned in the write-up. They had been going full steam ahead, and when the pandemic hit, and so it's kind of been on pause. But it's still very much a priority. It sounds like they're gathering steam again. And so the second takeaway that I would emphasize is that if you look at the composition of the people working on, as part of that working group, working on developing the plan, it's very broad. They have members of lots of different committees in town, as well as the police chief, as well as people associated with the school department, and it's not necessarily the answer to how do you do transportation planning, but I do think there's something definitely worthwhile to be said about bringing together people across the board and to talk about these matters. I think that's enough for starters anyway. I think there's definitely room for further collaboration. I've got some I sent some questions back to them for follow-up about ways we might work collaboratively as the two towns. We'll see how they respond to those, but is that a good start, Marianne, to your question?
That is a good start. And I would actually describe Megan as, you're correct, she's not a town manager because that's a different structural form of government. But as their town executive director, she is responsible for all parts of their government that are not otherwise governed by an elected board. Okay, So for example, that aligns for the most part with Needham, but as you noted, DPW and Wellesley is an elected board. And I will just offer to people for context, the reason why there was that study that is linked to in 2017 was because that was when Wellesley was going through sort of a charter discussion about were they going to move to a town manager form of government from the executive director. And after a hard fought battle, they did not make any transition at that time. Okay, so.
And both she and Colette, and I assume David also, I didn't double check, but are active members of that mobility group. I mean, of the transportation group that is working on developing that plan.
Okay. All right. And they have had a long-standing relationship with the Regional Transit Authority as another aspect of that mobility group. I'm thinking, I don't know, it predates me being at the college, I think, because as long as we've been meeting with them in our annual meetings, there's been discussion about the RTA, and we've done different things in terms of promoting changes in the offerings and trying to ensure that the offerings connect, for example, to us at the college around working hours. It hasn't always fit a working person's schedule to use the RTA. So continue to work with them on those issues, but it's been a long-standing relationship, and I'm mentioning that knowing that Michael Ruddy is here, and he had asked about Needham and the RTA at our last session. So good. All right. Karis, do you want to make any comments, or do you want me to keep going? I've sort of read through everything, and I also did a quick look at the framework and tried to pull out of what I have from our last discussion that I think needs to get added to the framework. But do you want to comment?
I think maybe I could just offer like a little bit of context for what would be helpful from a public works perspective. And I think right now it's finding a group to bring concepts and plans and projects to that isn't just the select board. So right now we do go to the select board when we have major changes in our infrastructure, but it's not really the forum to have like a comprehensive conversation about what those changes are or what they should be. So I think the framework was really helpful, I think, in contextualizing the types of issues that we might deal with, or the types of programs we're looking for, and the type of feedback we're looking for. And I think what the hope would be is that when we look at the committee structure, there could be a committee or some sort of organization that we can go to with our project plans, particularly with our capital budgets, and really think about where we should be either investing our money or the types of projects we should be doing, or even talk about the type of design that we should be trying to achieve and what those goals are. So I think that's sort of the little missing piece that I feel like right now we don't have in our department. And that would sort of be the context to which we would be hoping that looking at the framework and looking at how all of these different committees are chartered, seeing either where that need might fit within our existing charters, or if we need to rethink some of the chartering of those committees.
Adam.
Karis, just to follow up on that, if I could ask a question, you were saying that to have another board to go to instead of just the select board, was that right?
Yeah, so in my mind, I almost think of it as similar to like we have a solid waste advisory. So there's a committee that's appointed by the select board that helps provide them guidance. So basically a committee that can really dive into these issues more specifically and spend more time on them as opposed to the board, which is obviously concerned with running the town in a bigger picture. These things do eventually then go to the select board, but it's a process to really hammer out all the different minutia. So that way, by the time these things do go to the select board, you know, there's not a lot of public comment because the public has had an opportunity to comment. There isn't a lot of working out the fine details because it's already been vetted. So that's sort of what I'm envisioning.
And I agree. I was thinking of something that's advisory in nature, but that could provide a forum for more public input in helping to shape and flesh out those priorities.
What role does the moderator play in these kinds of organizations or frameworks or structures?
Some of these structures have shared appointing authorities. Okay, so the question is there a reason why this one would have a shared appointing authority or not?
Right. I've been giving thought over the last several weeks about, a kind of committee structure. I don't know if we're ready to talk about that, but I'm happy to briefly summarize my thought as it is at the moment. Which I guess is, it seems to me there are really 5 different areas that we're dealing with in transportation. One is through TMAC, which has typically been resident facing. The other is the Transportation Committee, which its origin, if I remember correctly, David, you said that it was really dealing with trying to preserve service through the MBTA in town between the bus and the commuter rail. The third was relating to the rail trail. The fourth was complete streets. And then this fifth are, I think, some of these overarching planning functions that I think Karis is looking for. And so it seemed to me that one structure that might work well, and we'd probably need some direction, I guess, Marianne and Kevin, from you, but whether it's a joint appointed authority or not, but either way, there would be this one committee of roughly 7 to 9 members that would be appointed either solely or jointly by whichever authority. And it's staff person, as the select board has Kate and the planning board has Lee. Here would be Karis. And it would meet either every 2 weeks or once a month. And the agenda would be comprised of elements of those 5 different areas between MBTA service questions, traffic concerns about town that may come from residents, rail trail planning, or questions or comments, and updates on complete streets and planning for complete streets. And then also having a planning function for the whole of the town based on the other transportation needs, I guess, that, Karis, that you identify. And I could see perhaps someone from the planning board being on that, so we can continue to keep Lee updated on what functions we're dealing with and whatever support may be needed. I don't know that it's really a zoning function per se, but that was the rough structure that I had in mind.
So I would just say my initial thought is I think it might be too broad a portfolio, and there might be good reasons to keep TMAC and the rail trail with maybe more focused agendas, and just have this function kind of looking at the complete streets and MBTA, or overlay of some kind of public transportation would be my immediate gut, but I'm interested in others' thoughts. So David?
Yeah, I think I share those concerns that what we've already have heard well articulated by Justin is how the TMAC has had its hands full responding to requests from citizens immediately respond to this, and this, and having not having the bandwidth to then think about long-term planning for the future. And now, granted, if any committee met every 2 weeks, or they might be able to accomplish a little more than we currently have been doing, or have been doing in recent times. But But I think if we take the 3 committees now and merge them in some fashion and expect one committee to do all of them, we might be creating a recipe for burnout. And I'm not sure who would want us to do that. I guess the overall comment I'd make is, I hear you, Adam, that it makes some sense to think about who we've got now and the committee, the overarching boards, et cetera. But for right now, I'm still in the dream mode of, should we reconceive of this entirely, and not necessarily work with just the select board and the planning board as they currently have in the reporting structures? But is there something even bigger? I don't have a plan, and I applaud you for thinking of one, but I just want to keep it wide open at the moment until and not necessarily start talking about the details of how often would this new committee meet that we haven't even decided we definitely want to have. Those are my words of caution.
And I would observe, while Wellesley has some different structures, ultimately those structures are advisory to their select board, right? Which is going to have to make decisions about how they're going to budget. But
Marianne, I just
Yeah.
want to ask Karis, it sounded like you were talking something a bit more politically facing, that you could sort of vet issues that as they come up, not that has to, I like Adam's plan, there's some merit to it. I think it's something to start with, but it sounds like you need something a bit more political facing.
So I think, and Marianne can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe all the solid waste advisory committee members are appointed by the select board currently.
yes,
So I think an appointment that comes from a political entity is helpful. And I think a venue to air out, questions and concerns is helpful. As far as, I've thought about it in a couple different ways. And I think really it has more to do with what you all think. Can you do it with representatives of existing committees? And is that too cumbersome because you all have so many obligations for the committees you're on? Or do you pick, completely different individuals to provide that representation? That's where I struggle with. I could see the benefits either way of having, I know I talked to Lexington and they have one where it's like a member of the planning board and a member of the select board and a member of the school committee. But I know that there's a lot of other demands on people's time. So I'm not sure if that's the most effective use. But could you see like a representative or an appointee coming from different entities, or representatives and appointees coming from the select board with kind of, again, a clear mission of trying to get people with a certain background, just like we do with the PVBC. So trying to get people who are involved in transportation or planning or other issues in the town. I could see that also working. So I think it needs to be a committee that is willing to hear from the public and willing to have some of these community conversations. As far as whether it has to be, who appoints it and how that comes about, I think there's a lot of different ways you could approach it.
yeah. Justin,
Sure. Thanks, Adam, for that proposal. I think there's a lot to unpack, but I think to Karis's point about a body to be able to advise on a set of priorities that the DPW will have at whatever cadence that they do corresponding to the budget is necessary. And I think that we still have a forward-facing committee to from the public. However, we don't need to have that 12 months a year. And you could utilize the bandwidth of, and I think we spoke about this, Marianne and Karis, on our subcommittee, that whatever committee that we end up coming up with. And I think we really should think through wanting to take all 5 functions and push them into one committee. I think we definitely just need to be cognizant of that, or whether maybe 2 committees makes more sense, a forward facing and then something else that would be more strategic and planning, because I don't know if you can fit all into one. But an idea is, instead of, because initially on its face, that's a lot of work. This is a lot of work ahead of us. But could the forward facing, let's call it legacy TMAC responsibilities, could be 6 or 8 meetings of the year, quarterly, 4 of those meetings. And this might be, we don't know what the appropriate cadence would be, but 4 of those would be strategic forward-looking advisory meetings where the agenda is just specifically with regards to strategic vision, budget, upcoming, whatever that may be, and then serving as that advisory. It's a reusing of a current committee and repurposing rather than, and that could be used as a stopgap until we figure out the long term, whether that's a cross-functional representational committee, bringing people from the planning board, bringing people from the school committee, because I also think we really need school committee representative too, because they have a lot of things that they're doing that impact traffic and planning across the board. So I think that's definitely, a whole that we definitely need to make sure they have representation. But so, I mean, there's a lot there, and I appreciate Adam for that. But I think we need to consider maybe not doing all for one purpose, and then looking at what is the need. The need right now is either a politically appointed body that would help the DPW advise on prioritization, strategic planning, complete streets, et cetera, and then you have the legacy TMAC, and they can have interface. They could have, one could be a subcommittee of, one could, we could figure out ways to make linkages between them. But I also think that an all for one purpose may not work and may be a disservice to what we're trying to do.
David?
Yeah, just one other thing. I'm not convinced that we really necessarily need to keep covering the MBTA in the way that historically we have, because so that might be down to 4 functions. I mean, our purpose was important, doing that the way we did it was previously important, but the ridership itself now reports problems routinely, and the word gets back to town hall long before we've had our meetings if there's a problem. And so it's just that the system has moved on. And now, having said that, I think our personnel, the people on our committee, want to contribute. And so I'm not trying to say don't give us work. I'm saying I'd welcome a revising of what we've been asked to do.
The repurposing of charter, yeah. And I do think you're right. So there are other structures, we now have a rep to the MBTA, there's different things I think that didn't exist in the same way when the transportation committee that largely dealt with MBTA issues was first created. So, but there is a wealth of talent in that group that if we can harness and use, I think it would be valuable. Okay. Dimitri, we've talked a little bit about rail trail. Thoughts on where you think it fits, doesn't fit, how it aligns?
I think that that in general, there is value in having it as a separate entity because it does have, the transportation aspect of it is relatively small. It's more, most of our time is spent on kind of more park and rec type things, if you know what I mean. So I think that I would probably keep it separate, to be honest.
So the interesting question I think with the rail trail is if we were to ever get a rail trail that actually started to truly connect multiple cities, then it has a different function in the network of transportation for the town. But you're right, given that those linkages are all significant pieces that we're working on, you're right, it has a more limited scale effect.
And even more, it doesn't have to be just town, because I think it depends on where. Because I think a trail that is Needham, Dover, Medfield is still primarily a park and rec type of thing. Whereas if there's more of a Needham Heights connect, how do you connect it through town, those kinds of things, even if it's just within Needham, then you're getting much more into the transportation aspects. So it just depends. I think it's more about, are we talking about how to connect it to other modes of transportation versus are we talking about, people riding bikes through the woods? But I think regardless of that, there's always, like, I don't think it would be a good idea to just merge it with transportation, because I think then the other things that it does would be neglected. So I don't know. I think maybe some kind of liaison, like whatever structure is created for transportation, I think there would have to be some overlap between the rail trail
Yeah.
group and that.
Yeah.
But I don't think it could be entirely subsumed. I don't know what, what that overlap would look like, honestly, but that may be something to sort of brainstorm as we move along.
Okay. Karis.
Yeah, so I agree with Dimitri in that the current rail trail as it's sort of set up doesn't really necessarily fit into the definition of transportation. But I think the hopes and dreams of most people are that eventually it will. I think where the overlap may be is really in that interconnectivity component. So the town, it really wasn't until 2 years ago that we were putting in dedicated bike lanes and really thinking that as part of our markings plan. So sort of how those lanes integrate with the trail. We right now have a project that we're hoping to move forward with some grant funding if we get it, but to look at the Central Street Bridge that may connect the rail trail over to Dover. Maybe it's then up to them to connect it back onto the trail. And then I know we're also looking at that potential connection, somewhere in the future to the junction. And then we've received some ARPA grant funding to look at that north section between Newton and Needham and what's possible to do in that section. So there are some overlaps actually between the rail trail, our transit network, actually our public transit network, where it is useful to think about biking more collectively. I don't think that, and Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we really have a committee right now that thinks about biking as a mode of transportation. I think really the only one that it fits under right now is the rail trail, even though that might not be the most appropriate for how we think of our road transit network.
Dimitri?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, because part of, I think, the way the rail trail committee has been structured, it's kind of the people that are engaged with it are it's through Park and Rec, and kind of that's that's the sort of Patty and then Stacy, right, are the people who coordinate it, and so that's been the sort of the history. As a result, I think there's been less attention paid to the transportation side of it. So again, maybe there's some way to do that overlap. I don't think that it's the right venue for biking as a mode of transportation, because that's a much bigger issue, and I would actually include that in whatever transportation overarching body we come up with, and maybe that would be the overlap. I don't know, but biking is because rail trail is just one thing, and there's a lot more bike lanes and all sorts of things happening that go beyond that.
But I think that recognition that we don't have a structure that currently recognizes biking as a mode of transportation is kind of the key takeaway here. So just like we said, complete streets never got to be part of anything. So thinking about complete streets for bikes, for walkers, for cars, right? How do we actually build that into whatever this next committee is going to be a key part of what we need to sort out. Yeah. Okay. Other takeaways that we have.
I did have a question, and this is just, so the rail trail, and Dimitri, you could correct me, that goes up through Park and Rec? Like who is the appointing of the rail trail? How does that, well, the reason why I ask is because Park and Rec is also another statutory body from the Commonwealth that is necessarily not represented, and perhaps would be an appropriate bucket, for lack of a better word, for some for this, if in fact that would make sense. We have obviously planning, we have a select board, we have schools, perhaps utilizations of Parks and Rec, and I just don't know too much about the rail trail, the actual structure, and whether that's appropriate to kind of have Parks and Rec be the overall liaison into this new committee, representing perhaps rail trail and cycling and other things. And I don't, it's more of a unfamiliarity.
I think the Rail Trail Committee, I think, was established, if I remember correctly, by the Select Board and appointed by the Select Board, but the sort of the person who coordinates it and arranges meetings, sets out the agenda, all those things
Staff liaison,
is the director of Park and Rec. So that's
Gotcha.
kind of what I mean by it being.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
I'm sorry, I was looking. I have a current committee list and I'm not putting my hands on it right away. I didn't have that with me for tonight. I was thinking I might be able to grab it. Because I'm not certain whether the rail trail is appointed 100% by the select board or whether there's a couple of people there who are appointed by other bodies. So I was just looking to confirm that, but won't happen now. David.
Yeah, it just occurs to me that a lot of what we've talked about, and especially when mentioning modes of travel, does kind of fit within the broader rubric of complete streets. And I'm wondering if that's the common element, a complete streets committee, as opposed to a transportation planning and management and whatever. I just did a quick search. There are towns that have complete streets committees that advise the select board trying to implement these principles. Just a thought, food for thought.
Karis, if that were to become an organizing principle, are there areas that you think we would overlook?
I do wonder about the tie-in of public transit to the complete streets concepts. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I think some of the issues we're having are not issues, but I know we've had people go to like the traffic management advisory committee about wanting to add sidewalks in certain locations. I'm not 100% that that's a complete streets. Just adding a sidewalk in and of itself is not a complete streets philosophy. It's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. So I think it might just, I mean, obviously we look at everything comprehensively, but if we're not going to be, we don't have plans to renovate a road. I don't know if we would look at all the elements of complete streets if we were then going to add a sidewalk to it. It's really when we want to change the right of way or we're going to make an improvement to that particular road, we would then look at complete streets principles. So I think maybe just the smaller one-off projects might not fit 100% into that concept. I think maybe that's where Wellesley may have come up with the mobility committee as opposed to a complete streets committee. I would imagine that that's their complete streets committee under their requirements for complete streets. But it just has a broader titling.
Yeah, Kevin.
All right, so I'm just trying to wrap my brain around this a bit. But I like the idea that Wellesley has the sustainable mobility plan. If we called a sustainable mobility group, so I think it was like a cog, and would engage with other cogs like the rail trail cog or group or the planning board, and would just understand and look at transportation issues as a whole, but then pull in other groups as needed. And I'm thinking like if there was a DPW sort of political facing committee that could be more engineering based. And so maybe the sustainable mobility group would just work with other groups as needed, as appropriate. And that would and their focus would be to make a sustainable, holistic view of transportation in Needham. And so we don't have to pigeonhole everyone into part of the group. We allow the group to sort of feed where it needs to as it comes across issues. Thoughts?
One of the things that I think of that's going to be true, whatever we call this, is that part of the challenge that we currently face with sidewalks is we don't have, in fact, really a set of principles that guide our decision making. And I think, from my perspective, that would be something that would be helpful, I think, to the select board, to the town, in terms of setting priorities. If we could look at certain areas, certain items that are challenging as we think about overall modes of transportation in town, and could understand what are the guiding principles that set the priority for what we would do where.
I think that's the biggest thing, is to actually have those principles. We don't have a speed management plan. We don't like, there are things that are part of, transportation planning that are and that really would guide, and certainly the committee falls into place, whatever, and whatever we end up doing, the governance of that. But we don't necessarily, we have bits and pieces. We have capital plan, we have bits and pieces for various things, but there isn't, at least to my knowledge that I've seen, speed management 101, every complaint that comes in is about speed. But how do we apply? What do we do? Do we go down to 25? Do we do the speed zones? There have been a lot of suggestions made from GPI on this, on the studies, but we haven't actually applied them because we don't know how to apply them. I think because we don't have a framework to establish them. I think there's a lot of great ideas, and we can't just throw them out. And I agree, we can't just do things ad hoc. We have to think strategically, and that, I think, is one of the, the outputs of this is to either come up with a comprehensive, complete streets, well, maybe not complete, but a transportation plan, traffic management plan, speed management plan, et cetera, going forward. I think those are the things that will guide, everything else will fall into place, I think, at that point. But we really, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I may have a silly question here, but I did spend some time looking for this, and I submitted some information late on Reading. But looking at their master plan, they have a whole separate section for transportation. And I tried to find a transportation section in one of the many Needham plans. I know there's the DPW plan, there was a couple other ones, but I couldn't really find it. And I'm wondering if it was just me, or, it would seem to me that it's difficult to decide where we're going to go if we don't have a really thorough study of where we are. And I just don't know if I missed that somewhere, or, if it's just, I'm assuming I missed it, Marianne, but I'm not really sure. So I figured I'd ask.
I
That's why
could
we're all
turn to
here.
Karen, but I actually don't think you've missed it. I do think that's something that the town hasn't done, is sort of a master plan, stepping back and rethinking. And part of it is, the ideas around complete streets and making that a more formal way that people are really thinking about things. To some extent, those are fairly new ideas. Now, I recognize when I say that they are not new, right? Bikes and walking have been around since almost the start of time, practically. All right, so it should be obvious that they should be part of the plan, but the idea that you're orienting a plan not around automobiles, but around these multiple modes of transportation is something that I think the world is really reconsidering very strategically over the last 5 years. It continues to grow in increasing focus. So I think that's a big part of how we need to reorient and rethink our transportation. So to the extent that something else already has a plan, it probably isn't oriented in that way either. So I don't necessarily feel badly that we don't have one right now, but.
That's very helpful, Mary. Yeah, and like I said, I was trying to make sense of kind of how Reading does transportation planning. And I tried to get somebody on the phone, but I didn't have any luck, to kind of just say, like, from a human perspective. So I was just gathering data that I could find out there. And it seems like they do have, a lot of resources devoted to the actual grand plan that includes transportation. And it's insane. It's wildly complicated, as I know that's why we're all here. But, I guess they determined that the two big things were the dependency on automobiles and the through traffic going through their town was the two biggest things that they wanted to address over a certain amount of time. And every so often, right, they do the update to see what's next. But I thought there's a lot to, as we say, unpack with this, a lot of different moving parts, but I do think that we can improve. Obviously, that's what we're all trying to do here. So thank you.
Karis, do you want to say anything about a plan? Have I missed it? Did we have a plan? I don't think we do.
Not anything comprehensive. I think you nailed it. I think we have a lot of different little plans. So we have a 5-year capital plan. We have a road rehabilitation plan. We have a sidewalk rehabilitation plan. We have a complete streets plan. But we don't really have, I think, back to that guiding principle conversation. We have our complete streets document that says when we do a renovation of the road surface or the sidewalk, we sort of take into consideration complete streets concepts. But as far as, and we have that, I forgot that pedestrian improvement plan that GPI did. So we have a lot of plans. I don't think we have one comprehensive sort of vision statement, one comprehensive direction, and one document or one structure that sort of lays all this out together with guiding principles. So I think that may be what we are missing as well.
I can see that David has his hand up, and I also see that Jackie has her hand up. So David, let me turn to you first, and maybe we can move Jackie over to hear from her.
Yeah, I was just going to say that echo, I think what Karis just said, that in the capital improvement plan I just pulled up, there's a page and a half or so on the public works infrastructure program there, and several of those paragraphs are issues that are transportation related, and the word transportation appears in there, but it's not sort of set out as its own concept of transportation, nor is there a public facing input. We don't have, like, the committee structures are designed to give the public a chance to have a say, and that isn't necessarily how you run a DPW. It's not how we run our DPW. So I think that we're trying to sort of, I'm glad that the DPW has addressed these issues in their report, but it would be nice if our committee structure was helpful in the process too.
Well, and I think aligned with all the various things that Karis raised, right? The town, I would also say, has done a good job of allocating funding streams for a number of these basic functions that we know need to happen, which also hasn't happened in other towns in quite as uniform a way. So it gives us kind of at least a base that we're working from. But I think we have a lot of benefit if we can think a little bit more holistically to make some of those priorities. Tyler, are we able to bring Jackie over? Ah, here she comes. Jackie?
Oh, hi everyone, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. My kids might storm over, so if I abruptly cut off and you hear kids, apologies in advance. No, the only thing I was just going to offer this conversation, and you guys actually already touched on it, was kind of the difference between the planning process versus kind of an ongoing committee. And I just wanted to offer my own experience as a staff person who chairs an advisory board for the state around sustainable mobility, is that it's an ongoing committee that meets with, public appointed members. But back into 2017 to 2019, the mission of the board really focused on helping us scope a planning process, and then they were the advisory board to a planning process. And then as we released statewide plans in 2019, the board continues to meet, but now they continue in an advisory capacity around implementation. And then as new and different issues kind of come up. And I feel like, just speaking from personal experience, there's definitely no right or wrong. But if anyone is interested in learning more or wants to chat after or between meetings, I'm happy to provide more information about how we had to make that choice. Do we create a one-off committee that supports that kind of planning process, or do we utilize an existing committee and that's its kind of main mission for that period of time, and then it flips back to kind of ongoing business as usual and implementation, if that makes sense. And so I just wanted to offer that. If that would be helpful, I'm happy to share information or kind of the framework. And then to Karis's point, the state also had a ton of individual plans, little plans here and there, policies. And so a major part of the planning process was just compiling, you know, that information and trying to put it in one place and in one public place. And then under the umbrella of what is our vision, what are our goals, what are our performance measures? So how are we actually tracking success, both qualitative and quantitative, and then those guiding principles, not as much focused on individual projects, but just that overarching kind of direction. And then the project work went back to staff, you know, to figure out.
That's helpful. Thank you. I do. It seems like we have sort of a set of integrating and planning work that needs to be undertaken. But I know everybody's anxious to figuring out how we get to being able to implement projects that will lead us to a more sustainably mobile place than we are right now. Adam?
I was a little old school there with my actual waving of the hand instead of hitting the raise hand function, but I guess it worked. It seems to me like we're actually starting to put some bones together. Like we have to put some skin on it, but it does sound like what I'm hearing, that the rail trail element is its own thing until that seems to work well in its current structure with Parks and Rec. When it gets to a point of connecting the disparate segments of the rail trail, that probably falls into a broader transportation thing. It sounds like TMAC continuing to serve the function of hearing and addressing traffic management issues around town continues to be its own thing. And then there is this transportation committee, which was MBTA focused before, but sounds like it could achieve whatever that new composition of it would be. Some of the elements of most of the elements for town planning and transportation, including the functions of complete streets. It sounds like that's what I'm kind of hearing overall. The one element that I think about through the planning board is, are there any of the projects that we're looking at from private developers, should we be somehow more mindful of any contribution they can play as part of any mitigation to contribute towards some kind of a town transportation plan?
I'm going to let Karis have first dibs on that.
I mean, I think a
And
pretty
we
good,
lost Justin somehow, so.
I think a pretty good example of that would be right now we're actually putting our plan together for the summer. We had a meeting today to try to get everything straightened out before I go on maternity leave for what our plans are. And one of the items we sort of talked about was we're looking at Central Ave, tightening a portion of it from Webster close to Gould, narrowing it, redoing some of the sidewalks and adding a berm. And one of that was part of the conversation was like, all right, well, where do we go when it comes to Gould's to make sure that when the old Muzzy property is looked at, that is a consideration for improvement there. So I think that would be a good example of that type of integration. Another project that we had, which was on Oak Street, we happened to be redoing the sidewalk on Oak Street. I think there was a developer also developing a property on Oak Street at the same time. Probably having that communication back and forth would have been helpful to say, hey, you should have them put in granite curb and you should have them put in, this type of sidewalk and everything else. So that would be addressed as part of the project as opposed to after the fact. So those are the two kind of things, one really big and then one really small in terms of where I think there could be better communication or integration between our summer planning, our construction planning, and then also developments that we see coming down and how they might be able to mesh really well with what we're currently doing.
To what extent, Karis, are you now working with Lee on any of those elements? Are they kind of siloed in different areas, or is there any collaboration?
So right now we do the planning review for all of the planning projects, and our engineering department does that. I would just say I don't think they've been particularly aggressive on pushing for improvements historically. And now I'm saying this out loud. I'm not entirely sure the communication, because sometimes these projects, I mean, they're reviewing them a year or 2 years in advance of actually breaking ground. You know, our plans tend to shift and change depending on where the gas company is going, where our resources are, what our budget is. So there's communication there, but I think it could be improved. And I guess the question would be where does the muscle come? Does it come from the political entity, or does it come from the Public Works Department making recommendations? And I think trying to figure that out will be something that our new town engineer will also be working on, because we've obviously had sort of the same model for a really long time in Needham.
I mean, certainly the planning board, the planning board.
I'm sorry, Adam. I'm sorry. Do you mind if I just interrupt? I have another conflict at 8 o'clock. I have to run off, but I'm sorry. I have to leave a little early here, but thank you very much. I
Thank
look
you,
forward
Keith.
to hearing. Thank you.
So it sounds like, Karis, that there could be an opportunity for greater integration so that planning and DPW are more aligned in some of the transportation and traffic management elements. The town engineer does get copied on the plans that come through the planning board actually before it gets to us. So theoretically, there is some oversight, but it sounds like we need a little more direct linkages, to address some of those. So, but I think this has been really helpful. It sounds like we're starting to get the skeleton together, and I'm liking what I'm hearing.
So I'm trying to capture all these on our framework page, because we're going to have to update that page and get it back out to people. But it feels to me like there's currently a review, Karis, that happens very early in the process with new projects. And it feels like one of the steps when you settle on your summer work or your winter work, whatever it might be seasonally, needs to be to look at what projects are under development in that area and whether we need to circle back to them.
Yeah, and I almost think it goes back to that guiding principle conversation as well. So it's like, what's sort of the guiding principle as far as what we think developers should be doing to improve mobility and traffic for their developments and how it impacts the town, and what's the town doing to improve mobility for itself, and kind of where does the overlap go? And I think maybe even just clarity on direction for that. So, we want developers to offset all of the traffic impacts or a portion of the traffic impacts. And I think that would be, and how far out is that scope, right? Because sometimes an impact could be, more far reaching than just the general vicinity of where they are. So I think that's maybe more the conversation. I think it's really like when it gets to a sidewalk adjacent to your property, that's like a really easy one. I think when it gets to other traffic improvements because of a larger development, it becomes more complicated. And I think having a philosophy about that may be more helpful in that review process as well.
So I do think when we look at, for example, a lot of the discussion around the Muzzy property did center around traffic and transportation related issues. And clearly that developer understands that mitigation in that area will be a part of the conversation. I don't think that we'll have, that we would have had a principle that said that the developer is always responsible for all of it, because I don't think any of us even know what that means yet. But there is certainly an ask that will be on the table related to that work, and that it's important for all of us collectively to be sure that we understand so we know what we need to ask for. Kevin.
Yeah, just something Kara said and Adam, but it's a turn of a phrase, but we need a committee that basically takes all these parts and knits them together as they come along. And maybe that's David's transportation committee repurposed, but that sort of is the traffic cop amongst all of them. That's sort of knits it together.
Yeah. Okay, David? I agree with that.
Yeah, thank you. So a few things. One is that the existing charge of the TMAC and the transportation committees both would need to be revisited under what the scenario that Adam just laid out. I noticed that there's the committee's charge for TMAC. There's a section in there. It says responsibilities include but are not limited to. Then it has 5 different things. And really, they've only been able to get to one, which is dealing with the public. And all those other 4 have to do with sort of advising the select board strategically to think in long-term matters. And if we treat them as I think you just sort of summarized, Adam, as they're going to handle that traffic stuff, it's sort of putting them back to that one out of 5 items. We want to just be clear about what we're asking of them. And if you're going to change the transportation committee, which I welcome, I really applaud, I would love it. But I just want to point out, we've met when we were most busy in my several years on this, we met 4 times a year. We haven't met in a while. This would be a substantial change for us. It's, I think, a welcome thing or a revisioned committee. We've had very little in the way of resources to work with. We've had a staff person who shows up once in a while, but we would need staff support in a way that we've never had before to take on additional roles. And finally, I would just throw in that the kind of transportation planning that we've been discussing in the last 10 minutes or so, we're talking about projects with a 2-year outlook. I still think we need to have a mechanism where we're thinking about projects that are 10 or 15 or 20 years potentially down the road. And so I'm not saying that has to be any particular committee, but I think the town needs that process in place. That's enough for now.
Okay. I can see Jackie's popped her hand back up again, so.
Oh, I just want it for whatever it's worth, and I know many of you know this, but regarding the planning discussion and thinking long term, I just think one of the reasons I've chosen to work in the transportation profession is this notion that like we shape the built environment and thereafter it shapes us, and transportation is just hugely powerful. And I think one of the things that I've learned in my 15-year career so far in transportation is that too much it is an afterthought. It's like, okay, let's see what happens and then we'll figure out the transportation. And so just keeping in mind that as the town is embarking on this process to revisit the committees and the structure, think about those guiding principles, is that the incredible power transportation has to say, okay, how do we design our transportation network? And then everything kind of like fits in from there. It doesn't always have to be an afterthought with development and with planning. And just thinking about, what do we want the public realm to look like, to feel like, and how do we want people to get around? And then things go from there. And too often we're left now with spending even more money and more time trying to retrofit spaces like after the fact, rather than kind of getting ahead of establishing what that vision is. And so just, how powerful this work is, for the community, and not having to wait to find out what the future developments are going to be, or wait to find out how housing may or may not evolve, or the team may or may not evolve, but, really create the network that we want. And then, things will follow from there.
Thank you.
And then a lot of communities, all the planning and development is inherently linked. There's an incredible amount of transportation projects that are getting done and long-term visions are getting executed because there's a direct linkage with development to realize those visions, which is pretty cool and powerful.
Okay. So I'm also thinking, and Karis and I had talked a little bit earlier, that we have sort of a lot of the pieces on the table that we know we need to figure out how to integrate. And my proposal is actually to ask if there's a few folks who would like to work on creating a straw man that could be brought back at our next meeting. I'm curious to get whatever Keith sent on Reading and be sure that we understand that as well. But it feels to me like we're at a point where we've sort of talked about a number of issues and some possibilities, and it probably makes sense to just put something on the table. Otherwise, we could talk in circles for a long time without moving this forward. And it feels like it is time. Do other people agree with that? Or I'm interested in a counter view too, if somebody thinks I'm completely off the wall.
I agree. That'd be great.
Okay. Then I might ask for a few folks who might be willing to meet maybe once or twice over the course of the next month in preparation to come back with, maybe at least some bullet points for some revised charters that can lay out a framework for how the committees that we have and don't have might relate. David, are you volunteering? Thank you. Good. Adam, is that a volunteering? Okay.
Marianne, I suspect that Justin and Keith might be willing, but they're not here. Just not to forget them.
All right.
Mary and I can help too.
Okay. All right. I don't want to put everybody on the spot, but I wanted to put it out there as an offer and see what we could do. With that, let me also just ask, I did last time as well, Tyler, Michael, do you want to come give any observations on tonight? Is Michael still here?
Yes, he's in the audience.
If you would like to come over and just share any thoughts based on the conversation we've had tonight, please put your hand up and we'll bring you over. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can
Yeah.
hear you. Good evening, Michael.
Yeah, I'm very encouraged by the discussion. It seems as though you've got some traction in place. I do especially like Keith's idea of the master plan. So whatever he can bring over from the Reading example, I think would be very valuable. But I think there is a lot of overlap. So I think there really needs to be a coherent vision rather than the structure of the individual committees.
Yeah. Okay, great. Jackie, any last thoughts from you also?
No, I'm happy to volunteer, Marianne, in whatever, capacity is, formally allowed, but just, let me know how I can be helpful and as a resident. And yeah.
Do you think you might be able to help on kind of structuring the committee? Is that permissible?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Other thoughts from the committee? Any other committee members? Or is it, in my case, dinner time? Since I started NEDA meetings at 5:30 tonight.
I can bring over some leftover chicken and corn and veg.
You know what? I've got some swordfish that's been cooked. So my husband's not hangry, but yeah. David.
Yeah, just sort of a parting thought that I've been meaning to mention it at some point, and I forgot to do it till now. which is, I think, fundamentally one area that we don't have that we may need to have is a professional transportation planner on staff in some form or another. And that doesn't necessarily mean a full-time person, but we don't have that. Unlike Jackie in the state, they have a lot of that. And it may be we have to come up with the resources to fund something like that. I mean, as much as our committees do good work, there may be an expertise level that we just don't have. Just throw that into the mix.
We are all good at identifying areas where greater expertise would benefit us. And we have the finance committee to curb our inclinations to do so. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider it. We should consider it, but it fits within a context, and we'll have to think about, are there other ways we can do that? Or is this the place where we should in fact add a position? So that's always a question that comes up as we're thinking about that. Karis.
So I just wanted to add to that a little bit. We've just gone through the process of hopefully hiring our permanent town engineer. And in that process, oh, sorry.
Oh, we'll give Karis a moment. Tyler, when we're working with this, oh, Karis, you're back. Go ahead.
And that, going through the process, it was interesting interviewing people from other communities and understanding that truly there are very few communities that take on the same role that our engineering department does in Needham. I don't think that's a bad thing per se. But what I will say is we will have a new town engineer shortly. And I think we will be discussing, or I'll be discussing with them, sort of their organizational structure and how they're utilizing their staff and how we could potentially utilize it better. We're also expanding our, hopefully, town meeting willing, expanding our engineering department as well to add another civil engineering position. So there are some opportunities potentially to look within our own engineering department and really think about the specialization we currently have and maybe how that could be reutilized if we choose not to add a position to the planning department. So there's some opportunity, I think, within our existing staffing structure that we might have.
It does sound like there is a need for a redistribution of capacity and staff support. And, that's one of the things, I guess, it sounds like David, Jackie and I, and maybe Justin and Keith will be talking about when we talk through structure and guiding principles and goals and things like that.
Okay. Tyler, will we be working with you to set up those sessions over the next month? I just want to understand process here.
My understanding was that the next session had been scheduled already on this.
So the next
call.
session of the full committee is scheduled, but if we
Oh,
want
right.
to get this working group together.
Yeah, I'm happy to set up the calls or whatever is necessary. I have the ability to do that.
Okay, so I will work with Tyler and we will figure out how to convene a group. Any last thoughts from anybody on the committee tonight, from tonight's discussion? David?
Just a clarification, Marianne, I assume you're part of that working group too?
I'm assuming I am, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
And the more things I can get done here and finish the sooner, the better, because climate is about to start. So, yeah. And even for me, I don't have the Hermione time turner yet. I keep trying.
We'll travel with Godspeed.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts?
It's nice to meet you all tonight.
Likewise.
All right. If we are ready, I would welcome a motion to adjourn, even though we didn't have a formal motion to start.
So moved.
And I'm not going to require a roll call. So all in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we will see you next month, since we do have these set up a month apart. And I'm thinking next month is just looking at what night we are.
It looks
So we're
like
on
it's
the
April
20th.
20th. Yeah.
Okay.
That might be school April recess.
It is, I believe, school vacation week. Is
So
that an issue for a number of people?
it may be an issue for me. I have to check with my wife and my son.
Yeah,
I'll circle back.
Okay.
same here.
So if it is an issue, can you just let Karis and Tyler and me know, and we'll figure out if we need to do some rescheduling. But between now and then, I'm going to encourage everybody to go vote in the town election on the 12th, because we have that between now and then. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mary.
See you.
Night all.
Night.
Bye-bye.